There is a rule inside the wealthiest families in the world that you will never see written on paper, and yet almost every one of them follows it with the precision of Scripture. The size of your fortune is inversely proportional to how much you talk about it. Walk into a room with a member of a 5-generation family and a member of a 5-year fortune, and you will almost always be able to tell them apart, not by what they're wearing, but by what they're willing to say. The new money will tell you what the car cost. The old money will change the subject before you can ask. This is not shyness. It is not modesty for its own sake. It is a trained psychological system, a set of deliberate behavioral tactics passed down through generations, engineered to do one thing: make wealth invisible to the people who might threaten it, while keeping it completely visible to the people who are meant to inherit it. Today we're opening up that system. Not the legal scaffolding. We've covered trusts and tax architecture in other videos, and we'll link those below. But the psychology underneath it, the mental training, the conditioning, the specific behavioral tactics that turn a family into what security professionals call a gray target, present, powerful, and almost impossible to see. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. Let's fix that. The architecture of silence. Every psychological tactic in this video sits on top of one foundational belief, and it's worth stating plainly because it explains everything that follows. Old money families treat information about their wealth as a liability, not a status symbol. This is a complete inversion of how most people are taught to relate to money. Mainstream financial culture treats visibility as the reward for success. You work hard, you buy the watch, you post the watch. Old money culture treats visibility as the risk that follows success. The watch isn't the trophy. The watch is the exposure. Once a family internalizes that belief, an entire behavioral system follows logically from it, and it operates on 3 psychological principles. Principle 1, information asymmetry is a form of power. In game theory and negotiation research, the party who knows more about the other side than the other side knows about them holds a structural advantage in pricing, in litigation, in marriage negotiations, in business deals, even in simple social dynamics. A family that nobody can accurately value cannot be accurately targeted by lawsuits, by kidnappers, by fortune hunters, by the tax authority, by a business partner calculating how hard to negotiate. Uncertainty about the size of a fortune functions as a kind of camouflage. If outsiders consistently underestimate the family's resources, every negotiation starts from a weaker position for the other party. Principle 2. Silence is trained, not innate. Nobody is born knowing how to deflect a question about money gracefully. This is explicitly taught, often before a child can read, through repetition, correction, and modeling. Children in these families are corrected in real time when they slip. A parent will interrupt a boastful sentence at a dinner party, redirect a conversation away from a topic, or simply give a look that a child learns to read by age 7 or 8. Over enough repetitions, discretion becomes reflexive rather than effortful. The child isn't thinking, "I should not discuss this." The child has no impulse to discuss it in the first place. That is the entire point of early conditioning, to move a behavior from the deliberate part of the brain to the automatic part. Principle 3. The family's real balance sheet is a closely held secret even within the family. This one surprises people. In many multi-generational families, only a small circle, sometimes just the family office director, the patriarch or matriarch, and one designated heir, knows the actual scale of the holdings. Cousins, in-laws, even adult children in some cases, operate with partial information. This isn't paranoia, it's risk management. Every additional person who knows the full picture is another point of potential leakage through a careless remark at a party, a boastful spouse, a disgruntled family member, or simple gossip. Compartmentalized knowledge, a structure borrowed directly from intelligence and corporate security practice, limits the blast radius of any single indiscretion. Together, these three principles create what we might call an architecture of silence, not a single rule, but a whole load-bearing structure of habits, corrections, and compartmentalized knowledge that makes the family's wealth psychologically and socially opaque, even to people standing right next to it. If this kind of mechanism-first breakdown is what you come here for, not aesthetic old money content, but the actual psychological and financial engineering behind it, this is exactly what this channel does every week. Hit subscribe now so the next one lands in your feed, because Section 4 on how children are trained from birth is going to change how you see every quiet family you've ever met. The gray man principle. In security and intelligence circles, there's a concept called the gray man, a person trained to be so unremarkable in appearance and behavior that they leave no impression on anyone who sees them. No one can describe them accurately 5 minutes later. Old money families apply a strikingly similar principle to their entire public presentation, and it's worth breaking down mechanically because it is far more deliberate than it looks. Behavioral camouflage starts with consumption patterns. The stereotype of old money driving an unremarkable car or wearing decades-old clothing isn't really about frugality. Many of these families could buy the dealership. It's about threat modeling. A visibly expensive lifestyle invites 4 categories of risk. Physical security threats, kidnapping and extortion, have historically targeted visibly wealthy families disproportionately. Legal exposure, visible wealth attracts lawsuits. Plaintiffs' attorneys openly refer to identifiable deep pockets as attractive targets. Social exposure, visible wealth invites social climbers, fortune hunters, and manipulative relationships that are hard to distinguish from genuine ones. And fiscal exposure, visible spending patterns, can attract tax authority scrutiny in certain jurisdictions. A family that manages its public consumption specifically to minimize all 4 categories isn't being modest for moral reasons. It's running a threat reduction protocol that happens to look like modesty from the outside. The second layer is linguistic camouflage. Old money families are trained to talk about money using specific, deliberately vague vocabulary. Instead of naming figures, they use relative language, comfortable, fortunate. We're careful with it. Instead of naming assets directly, they refer to categories, the property, the business, the trust, without specifying scale. This isn't evasiveness for its own sake. Linguists who study euphemism note that vague language reduces the amount of concrete, quotable, and repeatable information available to anyone listening. A sentence like, "We're comfortable," cannot be repeated as gossip in any useful way. A sentence with a specific number can circulate for years. The third layer is social filtering. These families are trained to be highly selective about which relationships get access to real information, using a mental model close to what security professionals call need to know. A close, tested friend of 20 years might know general facts about the family's position. A new acquaintance, no matter how charming, gets the vague version, indefinitely, until trust is earned over a very long timeline, often measured in years rather than months. This produces what looks, to outsiders, like coldness or standoffishness. Psychologically, it's closer to a vetting process, running quietly in the background of every new relationship. The fourth layer, and possibly the most counterintuitive, is deliberate ordinariness in physical presentation. Studies on impression formation show that people update their assumptions about someone's wealth heavily based on visible cues: clothing brand recognition, accessories, car type. Old money families are trained to actively manage these cues downward, choosing quality that doesn't advertise itself, fabrics and craftsmanship that a knowledgeable eye recognizes but a casual observer does not. The message isn't "we have no money." The message is "you cannot tell how much." What makes the gray man principle so effective as a psychological tactic is that it doesn't require lying. Nobody has to say anything false. The family simply declines to provide the data points that would let an observer draw an accurate conclusion. And in the absence of data, most people default to underestimation, not overestimation. That default is the entire mechanism. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many people in your own life could you accurately estimate the net worth of? If the honest answer is almost none, you've just felt the gray man principle working on you in real time. Drop a comment with the most quietly wealthy person you've ever met and what actually tipped you off. I read every one of these, and they shape what we cover next. Trust as a psychological shield, not just a legal one. We've covered the legal mechanics of trust structures in earlier videos: the tax treatment, the asset protection, the generation skipping provisions. What we haven't covered in depth is the psychological function trusts serve, which is arguably just as important to these families as the legal one. The first psychological function is what estate planners sometimes call the buffer effect. When assets sit inside a trust rather than in an individual's name, the family member is no longer, in a very literal legal and psychological sense, the owner. They are a beneficiary, sometimes explicitly designated as such, in family conversations well before adulthood. This distinction sounds like semantics, but families that use it consistently report a specific psychological benefit. It depersonalizes the wealth. When a family member is asked an intrusive question about money, they can honestly say, "That's not really mine to discuss," not as an evasion, but as a factually accurate statement, because the trust, not the individual, is the legal owner. This gives heirs a built-in, socially graceful, and completely truthful way to decline disclosure, removing the psychological burden of having to lie or invent excuses. The second function is the stewardship reframe, something we've discussed at length in our video on the psychology of the wealth ceiling. Families that successfully transmit wealth across 3, 4, and 5 generations, a feat that is genuinely difficult, however you measure it, tend to explicitly train heirs to think of themselves as temporary stewards of family capital rather than owners of personal wealth. This reframe has a direct psychological privacy benefit. If the money isn't yours, bragging about it, spending it conspicuously, or discussing it socially starts to feel like a violation of duty to the family, not just bad manners. The shame mechanism shifts from "don't be tacky" to "don't put the family at risk," a much stronger and more durable motivator because it recruits the heir's sense of responsibility rather than just their sense of etiquette. The third function is what we might call structural deniability. Complex multi-entity trust and holding structures, often spanning several jurisdictions, make it genuinely difficult for an outside party, a journalist, an opposing counsel, a curious acquaintance, to construct an accurate picture of total family wealth, even with significant effort. This is a well-documented feature of how family offices are structured, and it's worth being precise here. This is not, in itself, illegal or inherently deceptive. It is a legitimate application of trust and corporate law for privacy, liability separation, and succession planning. But it's worth naming its psychological byproduct honestly. Family members raised inside these structures often report genuine difficulty answering simple questions about how much the family has, not because they're hiding it, but because the structure genuinely obscures a single, simple total, even from many people inside the family. The opacity isn't just for outsiders. It becomes a kind of ambient psychological fact of life. The fourth function is decision insulation. When major financial decisions run through trustees, family office professionals, and committees rather than a single individual, it removes the emotionally loaded, socially visible moment of the rich person deciding what to do with their money. A trustee declining a request on behalf of a trust carries none of the personal social friction that the family member would face, declining it themselves. This is a deliberate psychological outsourcing of conflict. Professionals absorb the awkward, confrontational, or socially costly aspects of wealth management, so family members don't have to. It's worth pausing on something important here, in the interest of accuracy rather than sensationalism. None of this is exotic or secretive in a conspiratorial sense. Trust law, family offices, and multi-entity holding structures are well documented, heavily regulated, and used by estate attorneys and wealth advisors as standard practice. The psychological effects described above are documented in family business and wealth psychology research, not hidden knowledge. What's unusual isn't the existence of these tools. It's that almost nobody explains their psychological function to people outside this world, which is exactly the gap this channel exists to close. If you're finding this useful, do two things right now. Tap that like button so this reaches more people who are tired of surface-level, old money aesthetic content. And stick around for Section 4, because how families train an 8-year-old to keep a secret without ever using the word secret is one of the more remarkable pieces of behavioral engineering in this entire video. Training the next generation, childhood discretion conditioning. If there is one thing that separates genuinely old, multi-generational wealth from newly acquired wealth, it is this. Discretion is trained into children long before they understand why it matters. By the time a child is old enough to grasp the actual scale of family resources, the behavioral habits are already locked in as reflexes. This training tends to follow a recognizable developmental arc, and it's worth walking through it stage by stage because the mechanism is genuinely instructive. Ages roughly 3 to 7, modeling and correction. At this stage, children don't receive lectures about money. They receive corrections. A young child who mentions a vacation home in front of a new acquaintance might get a subtle redirect from a parent, a change of subject, a gentle, "let's talk about something else," delivered without drama. Children are extraordinarily good at pattern recognition long before they're good at abstract reasoning, and repeated redirection teaches an implicit rule. This category of topic makes the adults uncomfortable in front of certain people. The child doesn't need to know why. The behavioral association forms regardless. Ages roughly 7 to 12, categorization and rule formation. This is when children in these families typically begin to receive more explicit, though still limited, instruction, often phrased as etiquette rather than financial strategy. Common formulations documented in family business and wealth psychology literature, includes some version of, "We don't discuss money outside the family," or "It's not polite to talk about what things cost." Framing the rule as etiquette rather than financial secrecy is itself a psychological tactic. Etiquette rules feel like universal good manners rather than defensive strategy, which makes them easier for a child to internalize without feeling burdened or frightened by them. Ages roughly 12 to 18, selective disclosure, and the outside world distinction. Adolescents in these families are typically taught to distinguish sharply between two categories of people: family and trusted advisors on one side, and everyone else, including most friends, and eventually most romantic partners, until a relationship is well established, on the other. This is often the stage where children are given slightly more real information about family structures, the existence of a trust, in general terms, or a family office, paired explicitly with instruction on which parts of that information can never leave the house. Family governance literature refers to this as graduated disclosure. Information is released to heirs in stages tied to demonstrated maturity and trustworthiness, not simply age. Adulthood, full integration, and self-monitoring. By the time these individuals reach adulthood, external correction is rarely necessary because the behavior has become self-monitoring. Adult heirs from these families frequently report, in interviews conducted by family business researchers, that they feel physical discomfort, not just social awkwardness, when a conversation drifts toward specifics about their finances. That visceral, almost automatic discomfort is the clearest evidence that the training worked. The behavior has moved from a conscious rule to something closer to an emotional reflex. Two additional and less obvious tactics deserve mention here. The first is deliberate exposure to financial ordinariness. Many of these families intentionally give children summer jobs, ordinary schooling experiences, or modest allowances specifically so the child has a comparison point and doesn't develop a distorted, purely wealth-based sense of identity. Paradoxically, this ordinariness reinforces privacy training. A child who has stood behind a cash register or worked a retail floor has a much easier time blending into ordinary conversation than one who has never had to. The second is rehearsed deflection scripts. Just as media-trained executives are given stock phrases for hostile questions, some families explicitly rehearse simple, natural-sounding responses to nosy questions with their children. Not scripted word for word, but practiced enough that the child has a ready, non-awkward answer instead of freezing, or worse, over-explaining out of nervousness. A prepared "we're lucky, but honestly, it's not that interesting to talk about," delivered smoothly shuts down further inquiry far more effectively than an unprepared child fumbling for an answer, which often invites more curiosity, not less. It's worth being clear-eyed and non-sensational about something here. This training is not universally healthy, and it is not free of psychological cost. Family wealth psychology research has documented real tension in some of these families between the benefits of privacy training and feelings of isolation, difficulty forming trusting relationships, or a persistent low-grade anxiety about being found out or valued only for money. This is a real trade-off these families navigate, not a flawless system, and it's a topic significant enough that it deserves its own dedicated video. We go deep on the emotional cost of this kind of upbringing, including why some heirs actively reject family wealth altogether, in our video on why heirs walk away from inheritance, linked in the description and in the card above. If Section 4 resonated with you, that video is the natural next stop. The buffer class, using intermediaries as psychological distance. One of the most consistent structural features of old money privacy is the deliberate use of professional intermediaries, family office staff, private bankers, attorneys, personal assistants, not just for their functional expertise, but for the psychological distance they create between the family and any point of friction. The core mechanism here is what negotiation researchers call the agent buffer. When a professional intermediary handles a negotiation, a rejection, a dispute, or a difficult conversation on a family's behalf, the family member is never personally and visibly the one saying no. This does two things psychologically. First, it removes the family member from direct confrontation, preserving social capital and relationships that a personal refusal might damage. A business partner who is turned down by a lawyer tends to blame the process, while one turned down personally tends to blame the person. Second, it creates a layer of ambiguity around decision-making authority. Outsiders often cannot tell whether a decision reflects the family's actual wishes, a professional's independent judgment, or some negotiated position between the two, and that ambiguity itself is protective because it's harder to pressure, manipulate, or negotiate against a party whose true position you can't clearly identify. A second function of the buffer class is information filtering in both directions. Family office staff and private bankers are frequently the only people outside a small family circle who see real financial detail, and they operate under strict confidentiality obligations, often reinforced by NDAs, professional licensing requirements, and in many firms, the practical reality that a breach would end a career in a small, reputation-dependent industry. This creates a professional class with strong incentives to maintain discretion that are independent of family loyalty. A second, structurally reinforced layer of privacy protection on top of the family's own habits. A third, more subtle psychological function is what we might call delegated conflict absorption. Wealthy families are frequent targets of requests for loans, investments, charitable donations, favors from an unusually wide circle of acquaintances, distant relatives, and strangers. Fielding these requests personally is not just time-consuming. It is psychologically taxing, requiring repeated refusals that can strain relationships. Routing these requests through an intermediary, you'll need to speak with our office about that, allows the family member to remain warm and approachable in every direct interaction while the actual gatekeeping happens one level removed. Family business researchers note that this is one of the most valued functions family offices provide, often ranked by principals as more valuable than the technical investment services. The fourth function, particularly relevant to privacy specifically, is what security consultants call identity diffusion in transactions. Property purchases, investment holdings, and business interests are frequently held not in a family member's personal name, but through holding companies, LLCs, or trusts managed by these intermediaries, a legal and administrative practice, not a deceptive one, but one with a clear psychological privacy benefit. A public record search for the family member's name returns comparatively little, while the actual holdings sit several legal layers away, under entity names that carry no obvious connection to the family. Taken together, these tactics mean that a family member can go through an entire day, declining a business proposal, purchasing a property, donating to a cause, refusing a loan request from a distant cousin without ever personally being the visible party in any of these transactions. The friction, the visibility, and the paper trail all happen one professional layer removed. Controlled disclosure: how philanthropy and narrative management shape public perception. If total invisibility is the goal, why do so many of the world's wealthiest families end up with their names on hospital wings, university buildings, and museum galleries? This looks, at first glance, like a contradiction of everything covered so far. And understanding why it isn't reveals one of the more sophisticated psychological tactics in the entire system: controlled strategic disclosure. The key insight is that privacy and public visibility are not opposites in this framework. They are two settings on the same dial, and old money families are trained to control which setting applies to which category of information. Philanthropic giving is disclosed, often prominently, because prominent giving serves specific psychological and reputational functions. It builds social capital, secures institutional relationships that benefit future generations, admissions relationships with universities, board positions, access to influential networks, and, importantly, it replaces curiosity about the source and scale of wealth with a specific, controlled positive narrative about its use. A well-publicized donation gives the public a story to attach to the family name. In the absence of that story, curiosity tends to fill the vacuum with speculation, which the family has far less control over. This is a documented pattern in the history of family philanthropy. Major giving by historically wealthy dynasties in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Rockefeller family's public health and educational philanthropy is among the most extensively documented examples. Coincided with periods of significant public scrutiny of the underlying business practices that generated the fortunes. Historians of philanthropy have long debated the relative weight of genuine charitable motivation versus reputational strategy in these cases, and the honest answer, supported by the historical record, is that both were almost certainly present simultaneously. Sincere philanthropic conviction and reputational management are not mutually exclusive, and treating them as an either-or question oversimplifies a well-documented, genuinely complex historical pattern. A second controlled disclosure tactic is what public relations professionals call narrative preemption. Families that anticipate media attention around an engagement, an inheritance dispute, a business controversy, sometimes choose to release a limited, carefully worded statement rather than maintain total silence, precisely because total silence leaves a story entirely in the hands of speculation and other sources. A short, controlled statement can close off inquiry more effectively than silence, because it gives journalists something to cite, satisfying the immediate news cycle without providing meaningful additional detail. This is a genuinely different psychological tactic from the blanket privacy discussed earlier in this video. It is privacy through selective, engineered transparency, rather than privacy through total silence, and recognizing which tool is being used in a given situation requires paying attention to what specific detail is actually disclosed versus what remains carefully unaddressed. A third tactic in this category is reputational diversification, deliberately building a public identity around something other than wealth itself. A family's involvement in the arts, sciences, conservation, or a specific cause becomes the association that comes to mind rather than the balance sheet. This has a specific psychological benefit for the next generation. Heirs raised with a family identity anchored in a mission or a field of interest, rather than in wealth itself. Report. According to family psychology researchers who study multi-generational wealth transitions, a stronger and more stable sense of personal identity than those whose only inherited identity marker is the money itself. It's worth being clear and non-cynical here. This doesn't mean all philanthropic giving by wealthy families is calculated or insincere. That would be an unsupported and unfair claim about individual motivation that this channel isn't in a position to make about any specific family. What can be said with confidence, based on the documented historical pattern, is that strategic and sincere motivations for giving are not mutually exclusive, and that controlled disclosure functions as a genuine psychological and reputational tool, regardless of the underlying motivation in any individual case. We're covering exactly this kind of nuance, the difference between genuine motivation and strategic function, without flattening either one into a conspiracy, every week on this channel. If you want the next deep dive on family governance and generational wealth psychology, the moment it drops, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because next week's video breaks down the family constitution frameworks the Fugger and Rothschild families used to survive centuries of political upheaval. The cost of privacy, a cautionary example and final synthesis. Every system has a failure mode, and it's worth closing on this honestly, rather than presenting privacy tactics as a flawless formula. Consider a composite, illustrative example drawn from patterns family business researchers have documented repeatedly across multiple real cases. Not a specific family, but a pattern that recurs often enough to be instructive. A fictional multi-generational fashion house built over 3 generations on a foundation of extreme discretion reaches a 4th-generation succession crisis. The founders trained silence so deeply into the family that by the 3rd generation, almost no one outside a tiny inner circle understood the actual financial position of the business, including some family members with equity stakes. When a liquidity crisis hits, the family's own privacy architecture becomes the obstacle to solving it. Heirs distrust each other because no one has ever had full information. Outside advisors are brought in too late because the family's instinct is to hide problems rather than disclose them for help, and a controversy that could have been managed quietly with early, controlled disclosure instead becomes public and damaging precisely because the family's default reflex, silence, was applied to a situation where silence made things worse rather than better. This pattern illustrates something important that separates families who successfully sustain wealth across many generations from families whose privacy tactics eventually work against them. The most durable old money families treat privacy as a tool to be applied selectively and strategically, not as a reflexive blanket instinct applied identically to every situation. They can distinguish between information that should never leave the family, the total scale of assets, specific personal details, security-relevant information, and information that must circulate freely within trusted circles for the family's own protection, accurate financial position among key decision-makers, early warning of disputes or problems, honest communication between generations about expectations. So, to bring together everything in this video, the psychological tactics old money families use to protect privacy and wealth aren't a single trick. They're a layered system, an architecture of silence built on information asymmetry, a gray man principle of behavioral camouflage, trust structures that provide psychological as well as legal buffering, childhood conditioning that turns discretion into reflex, a buffer class of professionals who absorb friction and filter information, and controlled disclosure that manages public narrative deliberately rather than leaving it to chance. Understood correctly, none of it is secretive in a sinister sense. It's a documented, teachable set of behaviors and structures, refined over generations, that most people simply never get access to. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught. And now it is. If this broke down something you'd never had explained clearly before, you know what to do. Subscribe and check the 2 videos on screen now. Our deep dive on family governance structures using the Fugger and Rothschild case studies, and our video on why some heirs choose to walk away from generational wealth altogether. See you in the next one.